You bought that medal online. Greg's voice rose above the humming printer, just loud enough for the whole county office to hear. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the morning line shuffled forward, boots thudding against the salt-stained tile. Outside, a dry November breeze slipped through the cracked front door, tugging gently at the papers pinned to the bulletin board. One flyer flapped a little more than the rest. Bold red letters read, Veterans Day Ceremony, Sunday, November 12. Memorial Park. No one looked at it. No one but the man in the worn jacket. Elias Dunn stepped forward quiet as the wind behind him. His boots were polished though dulled with age. His coat, brown wool with a corded collar, was immaculately pressed. On its lapel gleamed a single medal pinned with deliberate care, a bronze star with a small raised V. He moved slowly but without hesitation, placing a folded envelope on the counter where Greg Tolliver leaned. "I'd like to file this motion," Elias said. His voice was low but clear, measured in the way someone might speak when they've been heard too little and misunderstood too often. Greg blinked once, then glanced at the medal. A grin tugged at one side of his mouth. "Well, look at that," he said, pushing the envelope aside with the back of his knuckles. "Didn't know we had a war hero among us." He reached for his thermos, the navy blue one with the words Hamilton Proud in block white, and took a loud, deliberate sip. "Medal looks awfully clean for something that's been to battle," he added. "eBay, right?" Elias didn't respond. His eyes didn't twitch, his mouth didn't move. He simply waited. Nina Tolliver, seated 2 desks away, looked up briefly. She caught Elias's hands, broad-lined, the kind that knew tools better than keyboards, and looked back down just as quickly, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. She didn't say anything. No one did. Greg leaned forward, elbows on laminate. "So, what's this about? You disputing a late fee, or you asking us to roll out a red carpet?" Elias opened the folder. There was a fine issued for a parcel of land off Route 47, he said. "I'd like a hearing. Public." That made a few heads turn. "You want a hearing?" Greg echoed, feigning surprise. "Public what? Trying to make a scene. Get your 15 minutes before the Veterans Day thing." A quiet chuckle came from a man in a camo hat behind Elias. Elias remained still. Just making a record. The printer whirred back to life beside them. Greg didn't look at the envelope. Instead, he nudged it toward the inbox with a bored flick of his hand. "You'll need to fill out the supplemental form too," he muttered. "I've included it," Elias replied. "Signed and notarized." Greg made a show of inspecting the corner of the envelope, then tossed it in a plastic tray marked "Process Later." "You'll hear back sometime this week," he said, turning to sip again from his thermos. "I'll be here Friday morning," Elias said, stepping back. "You'll have my paperwork by then." Nina's fingers finally moved, typing a date into the scheduling software with more force than usual. She kept her eyes down, though she found herself watching Elias from the corner of her vision. How he adjusted the collar of his coat just slightly, how he turned without slouching. As Elias walked toward the door, Greg called after him. "Don't forget your costume, metal hero." "He's probably one of those online impersonators," Greg muttered to his buddies at Dixon's Diner, waving his fork like a gavel. The men around the table laughed in that half-muffled way, common among folks who knew each other's habits better than they knew their grandkids' birthdays. The coffee was hot, the hash browns were crisp, and the rain outside kept the windows fogged just enough to feel like the world stopped at the edge of Main Street. At a corner booth by the window, Carla Mears sat quietly with a pale blue mug and a bowl of oatmeal growing colder by the minute. Her spoon hovered mid-air, motionless. Her eyebrows arched ever so slightly, but she said nothing. Her back was straight, her cardigan buttoned to the collar. She watched without watching, a skill honed over decades in government buildings and small-town politics. Greg took another stab at his eggs, clearly enjoying the spotlight. Guy walked in like he owned the place, metal shining like he just unboxed it. He snorted, asked for a public hearing like he's some kind of whistleblower. One of the old-timers in a VFW jacket chuckled. Should have asked him what unit he served in. Most of these fakers trip on basic details. Greg leaned back, sipping from his thermos, still the same Hamilton proud. Didn't need to. You can smell the fake ones. Across the counter, Nina Tolliver offered a weak smile, topping off a few mugs with decaf before stepping into the back. She didn't speak much that morning, not even to Greg. By the register, a wooden plaque hung slightly crooked in honor of those who served. Beneath it, faded photos showed young men in sepia-toned uniforms, a few with shaky handwriting noting names and years. Some were smiling, some weren't. The rain picked up slightly, tapping a steady rhythm against the front windows. Carla finally set her spoon down and stood. She nodded at the waitress, left a 5 under her saucer, and stepped outside into the wet air. By mid-afternoon, she was back at the courthouse. Her desk was lined with neat folders, a faded bobblehead of Abraham Lincoln nodding politely beside her keyboard. She opened a state personnel system and typed "Done, Elias." No results. She frowned. Tried again with just "E done." Still nothing. She leaned back, her lips pressing into a thin line. That name had been in circulation, someone with a record, or at least a line of data. She glanced at the sticky note taped to the edge of her monitor, Veterans Day program. Pending final name. Across town, Ralph Enders sat in his den, surrounded by boxes of old letters, dog-eared books, and a radio that crackled more than it spoke. The house smelled faintly of cedar and pipe tobacco, even though he hadn't smoked in 20 years. He wore his usual brown wool coat indoors, more from habit than chill, and his cane rested nearby, 9th Infantry insignia carved deep into the wood. He pulled a scrapbook from a shelf, the binding half-torn, and flipped through pages worn soft with time. Yellowed photographs, typewritten names. His eyes narrowed when he reached a grainy shot taken somewhere along the Mekong Delta, 4 men crouched behind sandbags, one reaching toward a wounded soldier. Beneath it, faded ink read, "Private Dunn, Rescued Fire Team, March 1971. He leaned forward, nose nearly touching the plastic sleeve. Could it be, he whispered. Back in town, the drizzle had turned to mist. Elias's old green Ford was spotted on Pine Street, parked at the far end near the post office. He stepped out slowly, hands gloved, jacket buttoned high. He didn't glance at the diner, didn't meet eyes with anyone. He entered the post office, head low, shoulders steady. A few townsfolk looked up but said nothing. Carla returned to her desk after lunch and found a plain envelope resting on her keyboard. No return address. Just her name typed in small block letters. Inside was a single sheet, classified request. Granted. Her breath caught for just a moment. She tucked the page into a file folder and didn't say a word. A mile away, Ralph picked up the phone, dialed a number from memory, and waited. When the line clicked open, he said simply, "I think I know that man." The courthouse was unusually full for a Friday morning. No one said it, but they were all there for him. They came in 2s and 3s, boots thudding against stone steps still damp from yesterday's mist. The air outside had that brittle November chill that bit the skin without warning. At the flagpole, the stars and stripes fluttered halfway up the line, a signal of remembrance or maybe expectation. Inside, the tall hallway echoed with clipped heels and murmurs that fell silent the moment one crossed the threshold. Near the front row of the courtroom, a single chair bore a white paper folded across its back, reserved. The last time this many townsfolk had gathered in court, it had been for a zoning dispute over a strip mall no one wanted. Today, no one seemed sure what this was about only that it had something to do with the quiet man from earlier that week, the one with the medal. Or no, wait, maybe no medal at all. Rumors had already blurred into myth. Greg Tolliver stood near the bailiff's desk, hands stuffed into the pockets of his courthouse-issued fleece, tossing out strained chuckles like fishing lines. "Could have brought popcorn," he muttered to the officer beside him. "Bet the guy's gonna spin some story about black ops and time travel." The bailiff didn't respond. Behind them, Carla Mears stepped into the chamber clutching a folder marked Veterans Day Program. She made her way to the clerk's table, nodded once at the judge's assistant, and took her seat without a word. Her eyes scanned the room, slowly settling for a breath too long on the man seated in the third row. Elias Dunn sat quietly, hands folded, wearing the same wool coat from earlier in the week, buttoned neat, nondescript. The medal was gone. No pins, no flourishes. Just a man sitting like he'd been there 100 times before. Ralph Enders sat near the back, leaning slightly forward on his cane. His old coat rustled when he shifted. His eyes, however, never left Elias, not for a second. At precisely 9:00, Judge Harriet Connolly entered through the side door robe swinging softly behind her. She looked rested, composed, her graying hair pulled back in a neat twist. She greeted the room with a simple "good morning" and took her seat at the bench. Then the bailiff called out, "Case hearing done views. Ravalli County Assessor's Office. Motion to dismiss Fine's request for open testimony." Carla rose slightly and walked the folder to the bench, placing it on the wood without a word. Judge Connolly thanked her with a nod and opened it. Her eyes scanned the motion. Then they paused. One page in her fingers slowed. 2 pages later, they stopped entirely. She blinked. Her hands stiffened atop the folder. Greg coughed once, a little too loudly. "Just tell us where he got the prop medal," he whispered toward the bailiff. Again, no reply. Judge Connolly remained still. She turned a page, then another. Her lips pressed together, color fading slightly from her cheeks. She flipped the final page with a practiced hand, but there was nothing routine in her expression. She looked up not at Greg, not at Carla, but at Elias. There was a quiet stillness in the room, like everyone sensed something just beneath the surface was shifting. Judge Connolly slowly stood. "Mr. Dunn, I know this name." She adds softly but clearly, "You saved my father." Judge Connolly placed the folder on the bench like it might break, then turned to Elias and said, "Would you please stand?" The room didn't exhale. No one shifted in their seat. It was the kind of silence that pulled taut across a place when something unspoken finally prepared to surface. Outside the windows, golden leaves twisted in the wind, scraping against the pane like faint whispers. Judge Connolly remained standing, one hand resting gently atop the folder, as if it were a relic. Elias rose. No rustle, no sound from the legs of his chair, just a quiet motion, a nod of acknowledgement. His coat was still buttoned, his hands clasped behind his back, and the space around him felt somehow both small and vast. Ralph Enders leaned slightly forward in the back pew, his voice barely audible. "I knew it." The judge adjusted her glasses, then began to read, not with ceremony, but clarity. "Silver Star, Bronze Star, with Valor, Purple Heart," she said, each word measured. 3 additional commendations for bravery under fire. Her eyes flicked across the pages. "Service under Operation Stone Field. Unit 3rd Infantry Intelligence Liaison. Army classification cleared red." She looked up briefly, then down again. "Unlisted redeployments. Final recommendation. Exceptional conduct under covert humanitarian conflict zones. Retired with distinction. Request anonymity honored." A few murmurs stirred from the seats behind Elias, but no one spoke aloud. Judge Connolly set the page down carefully. In March of 1971, a fire team was struck by a roadside incendiary device in Binh Duong province. She paused, breath steady but shallow. One of those soldiers was dragged from a burning vehicle, shielded by another man's body. She swallowed hard. That soldier, she continued, eyes now steady on Elias, was my father. Elias inclined his head slightly. He made it home, he said. Just that. No elaboration. No shift in posture. A long breath passed through the gallery like the echo of distant wind through empty trees. Then, without speaking, Judge Connolly stepped down from the bench. She walked past Greg Tolliver, who sat stiffer than usual, fingers curling around the edge of his seat, and past the clerk's table, where Carla Mears was now frozen mid-keystroke. The judge reached the courthouse doors and pushed them open to the lawn beyond. The flagpole stood bare for just a moment, the rope slack. With practiced ease, she pulled the cord taut, unfurled the American flag, and raised it slowly, hand over heart. The sound of the rope clinking against the pole filled the air like a slow metronome. Across the street, a teenager in an ROTC uniform pulled a bugle from his case, glanced uncertainly toward the crowd gathering by the courthouse steps, and then, with a shaky breath, began to play. The first notes wavered, then steadied into a clear, solemn line of taps. Inside, Greg made a move to rise. His mouth opened as if to form a question or an argument, but he sat back down before finishing the first word. The judge didn't even glance his way. She walked slowly back toward the door, her robe catching the autumn breeze, face unreadable. On her way back to the bench, the judge pauses beside Elias and says only, "Welcome home." At Dixon's diner, Greg sat alone with a cold plate of scrambled eggs and a check no one picked up. The steam had long since vanished from the eggs and the butter congealed in a quiet pool beside the toast. Greg's fork tapped the edge of the plate, not eating, not moving, just marking time. Across the room, two regulars sipped their coffee without looking up. A pair of retired nurses whispered about casserole ingredients by the window, and a young mother wiped syrup off her son's chin with the kind of focus that excluded everything else. Above the register, the wooden plaque caught the morning light. Honor isn't loud. Greg read the words again and again. He'd seen them every day, joked under them, ordered double bacon beneath them. Today, they sat heavier than the smell of frying oil. He pushed back from the booth, stood slowly, and walked up to the register. The girl behind the counter didn't smile. She rang him up without a word. The total blinked back at him, $6.75. Greg dug a crumpled 10 from his wallet, hesitated, then slid a 5 across the counter. He didn't say why. Outside, the wind cut low and steady. Clouds hung like wet wool across the rooftops. Chimneys around town puffed soft trails of smoke, carrying the scent of pine and ash. It was the kind of November morning that made people think about warmth in more than just temperature. Nina Tolliver stood at the kitchen counter, wrapping a jar of homemade apple jam in a square of muslin. She'd tied the twine 3 times before finally stepping back. The label read, "Spiced Apple, Fall 23. No signature, no note. Just a small folded card tucked under the twine. We didn't look hard enough." She walked the trail behind their house the back way toward the edge of town, where Elias's cabin stood quiet, behind a hedge of frost-kissed wild rose. She didn't knock. Just placed the jar and card on the wooden porch beside a doormat that looked recently swept. Then she turned back the way she came. Across town, Elias was kneeling beneath the memorial tree at Veterans Park. The grass was thin there, patchy with dry leaves, but he cleared a spot with care. From a cloth bundle, he removed a small wooden case inside a neatly folded flag. He didn't look around, just placed it at the base of the tree, and sat for a moment on the nearby bench. He pulled a second item from his coat pocket, a bouquet of forget-me-nots. Small, deliberate. He rested them beside the flag fingers lingering on the stems before letting go. Not far from the park, Ralph Enders sat at Carla Mears's desk in the courthouse. His cane rested against the side of the desk, worn handle exposed. He'd asked for one thing to see the Veterans Day program. Carla handed it over without a word. Ralph flipped through, slowly nodding. "I always wondered," he said at last, "who pulled him out. My CO in Nam, he never told me. Said it wasn't the kind of story to brag about." Carla smiled gently. "Now we know." She pulled a laminated card from the printer tray and slipped it into a small metal frame, guest of honor. No speech needed. She placed it atop the stack with care. Back at the diner, Greg sat in his truck. The engine wasn't running. He pulled out his phone, typed in Bronze Star 5 device, hesitated, then added Elias Dunn. Several links appeared. Most were dry reports, government PDFs. But one image buried deep in a 1983 archive made him freeze. There it was. A younger version, maybe mid-30s, in a dusty combat uniform, standing beside a wrecked transport. The medal was pinned exactly where he remembered. The caption read simply, "Staff Sergeant E. Dunn, Operation Stone Field, 1971. Greg lowered the phone slowly, the silence in the truck louder than any engine could be. Across town, behind frosted windows and a neat front porch, Elias's cabin remained still. Then softly, the porch light flickered on for the first time in weeks. The seat was simple, no ribbons, no microphone, but the entire town knew who it was for. Folded neatly in front of it sat a small program card with block letters, "Guest of Honor." No speech needed. It faced the flagpole at the center of Veterans Memorial Park, where the air was sharp and still, each breath visible in the early light. A light wind moved across the open lawn, rustling coats and scarves as people took their places, forming quiet rows on folding chairs. Distant church bells marked the hour 9:00 a.m. Carla Mears stood near the back, clipboard in hand, directing late arrivals with soft nods. She avoided attention as always, but her eyes found that empty seat more than once. It sat between the mayor and the VFW commander, both of whom kept their hands folded and their expressions solemn. Near the edge of the crowd, Elias Dunn stood alone. His coat was buttoned the same brown wool worn earlier that week. Underneath, pinned with the same care he used to fold his flag, rested the Bronze Star, unseen but present. His hands were gloved. He held no speech, no flowers, just a quiet awareness of the moment. Judge Connolly stepped forward to the small podium as the soft music faded. Her voice was clear but low, unhurried. "We gather today not only to remember," she said, scanning the seated crowd, "but to recognize." She opened a small black book and began to read the names, each followed by a pause. Some names were familiar, others long gone, but every syllable was met with stillness. When the list ended, she closed the book gently and said, "Today we add a new tradition. Each year one chair will remain empty for the quietest heroes among us. The ones who don't raise their voices, but raise the standard for all of us." She didn't look toward Elias. She didn't need to. A murmur moved through the crowd as Greg Tolliver stood. His steps were slow. He held a folded note in both hands, worn at the creases. He faced the gathering, then turned toward Elias. "We judged before we knew," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I'm sorry." He didn't wait for acknowledgement, and Elias didn't speak. He only nodded once. Then, with deliberate steps, Elias moved to the flagpole. He knelt and placed the small bouquet of forget-me-nots at its base. The gesture was quiet. It needed no explanation. A bugle played taps, clear and unbroken. As the final note faded into the wind, Elias turned and began to walk away. He didn't wait for applause. None came. Only silence. From her spot near the tree, Carla smiles as she watches a young boy salute Elias's retreating figure. The wind carried no music, but the silence said enough. In a town that once whispered behind folded arms, a quiet man reminded them that valor doesn't shout, it simply endures. Kindness, after all, doesn't wear a badge or demand applause. It plants itself like a seed, blooming in moments we least expect. Like the porch light left on in early November, compassion shines best when it expects nothing in return. If this story found its way into your heart, perhaps today is a good day to listen more gently and judge a little less.